My older brother, Julian, slammed his fist onto the mahogany dinner table, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of my parents' mansion. My sister snickered into her wine glass, and my father didn't even look up from his plate. For 6 years, I had been the family outcast, the sister who refused to join the corrupt family business, taking a humble job at a veteran outreach center instead. They treated me like a ghost, a disappointment, a charity case living in their shadow. Julian leaned in close, his eyes full of spite. You have no future, no real power, and nobody who respects you. I kept my head held high, quietly sipping my water. Because at that exact second, heavy boots thundered up the front steps, and the dining room doors burst open. 3 active-duty army soldiers in full dress uniform marched into the room, their chest medals gleaming under the chandelier. Julian froze. My father dropped his fork. The highest-ranking officer stepped forward, looked right past my father, stood at attention, and gave me a crisp, formal salute. "Captain Clara Vance," the commander announced, his voice booming through the silent room. "The Pentagon has officially cleared your clearance. General Miller requires your presence immediately." My family's faces drained of color. They had no idea who I really was or what I'd been secretly doing for the last 6 years. My name is Clara Vance. I'm 26 years old, and to my entire family, I was an absolute nobody. I grew up in a sprawling, multi-million-dollar mansion in the suburbs, surrounded by expensive taste, fine china, and endless arrogance. My brother, Julian, who is 29, was groomed from birth to take over our father's corporate empire. My sister, Evelyn, at 24, was already a high-powered corporate strategist who never let anyone forget her Ivy League degree. They drove foreign sports cars, wore designer clothes, and measured a person's worth strictly by the balance in their bank account. And then there was me. 6 years ago, I made a choice that essentially made me dead to them. While Julian and Evelyn took executive corner offices at Dad's firm, I took a modest job working at a local veteran outreach center down by the docks. To my family, it was a humiliating disgrace. They treated me like a charity case, constantly mocking my simple clothes and my supposedly dead-end desk job. Julian loved to remind me at every family dinner that I was nothing more than a glorified secretary who had wasted her potential. What Julian and my father didn't know, what no one in my family knew, was that my modest desk job was nothing more than a carefully crafted cover story. In reality, I was a lead cybersecurity intelligence specialist working under a top-secret military defense initiative. For 2 whole years, I had been quietly tracking high-level defense contractor fraud, investigating companies that were secretly putting active-duty soldiers in danger to line their own pockets. And my investigation was finally leading me right to my family's front door. The night of Julian's big corporate promotion, the atmosphere inside our dining room was suffocating. Sunlight faded behind heavy velvet curtains as my father uncorked a $500 bottle of Cabernet, pouring generous glasses for Julian, Evelyn, and himself. They clinked their glasses together, celebrating another quarter of record-breaking profits for the family business, completely ignoring my empty glass. I sat quietly near the end of the long mahogany table, nursing a glass of ice water. I was wearing a simple slate gray dress, looking as plain and unassuming as ever. That was by design. In my line of work, staying invisible is a survival tactic, but to my family, it was just proof of my weakness. Midway through the main course, my father set down his fork and locked his cold, analytical eyes onto me. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping into that familiar corporate tone he used when making demands. "Your brother is expanding our logistics division into defense supply. To secure the capital, we need to consolidate our internal holdings. We need you to sign over your shares of your late mother's trust fund to Julian tomorrow morning." I gently set my napkin down.
"No, Dad."
Mom wanted those shares set aside for veterans' housing initiatives. "I'm not transferring them." Julian's face flushed with instant rage. He slammed his fist onto the table, making the silverware rattle. "Are you out of your mind?" he barked, leaning across the table until I could smell the wine on his breath. "You're sitting here wasting Mom's legacy on hobos while we're building an empire. You don't have the brains to manage money, Clara." You're a useless drain on this family, living off our scraps. I stared back at him, my heart steady, my pulse calm.
He thought he was intimidating me.
He had no idea that while he was shouting, my encrypted watch was silently vibrating against my wrist, signaling that the federal task force had just crossed into our neighborhood. The echoes of Julian's harsh words still hung heavy in the air when 3 sharp, heavy knocks rattled the grand front doors of the mansion. My father frowned, visibly annoyed by the interruption during a private family dinner. "Who on earth could that be at this hour?" he muttered, motioning for the butler to answer it. Before the butler could even reach the entryway, the heavy double doors swung wide open. Heavy, polished combat boots thundered against the marble floor of the foyer. The room fell into absolute, dead silence as 3 active-duty United States Army soldiers marched into the dining room in crisp, dark dress uniforms. Their chests were covered in gleaming metals, and their expressions were carved from granite. Julian immediately stood up, puffing out his chest with his usual smug authority. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, stepping forward like he owned the military itself. "This is a private residence. You can't just barge in here." The highest-ranking officer, a towering lieutenant colonel with steel-gray hair, didn't even blink. He completely ignored Julian, stepping right past him as if my brother were invisible. The officer walked straight down the length of the long mahogany dining table, stopping precisely 3 feet in front of my chair. My father dropped his silver fork, his jaw slackening. Evelyn froze with her wine glass halfway to her mouth. The lieutenant colonel came to a sharp, flawless attention, clicked his heels together, and rendered a crisp, formal military salute directly to me. "Captain Clara Vance," the commander's voice boomed through the high-ceiling room, echoing off the chandeliers. "The Pentagon has officially cleared your top-secret clearance. General Miller requires your presence and full authorization immediately." I stood up slowly, unbuttoning the plain gray cardigan I wore to reveal my military identification badge pinned underneath. My posture shifted instantly from meek outcast to commanding officer. "At ease, Colonel," I said calmly, looking back at my family's completely pale, horrified faces. "Stay seated, everyone. We're not finished here." My brother Julian stood frozen, his arms still raised from his earlier outburst, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Captain," he stammered, his confident demeanor crumbling into complete confusion. "Clara, what is this? What joke are you playing?" I didn't answer him. Instead, I gestured toward the officer beside me. The lieutenant colonel stepped forward, opening a heavy, military-grade briefcase and laying a stack of stamped federal warrants directly onto the mahogany table, right over my father's expensive plate of food. "2 years ago," I said, my voice cutting through the silent room like a razor, a young soldier walked into my outreach office. He was wearing body armor supplied by Vance Logistics, our family's defense contracting division. That armor had failed during a routine training operation in Texas, severely injuring his best friend. My father's face drained of what little color it had left. He tried to speak, but no words came out. "I personally took that vest apart," I continued, leaning over the table and looking Julian dead in the eye. "I discovered that to boost your Q3 profit margins, you secretly swapped out high-grade tactical ceramic plates for cheap, industrial-grade substitutes. You signed off on the safety certifications yourself, Julian. You risked the lives of hundreds of active-duty men and women just to buy another sports car." Julian gasped, taking a shaky step backward. You were just supposed to be working a desk job. You were filing paperwork. That desk job was my cover while I built a bulletproof federal case against this entire company," I replied coldly. "Every contract, every fake invoice, every forged safety report you created, I routed directly to military intelligence. I wasn't wasting my life, Julian. I was gathering the rope you used to hang yourself." Before Julian could utter another lie, the heavy front doors creaked open once more. 4 federal agents clad in dark suits and windbreakers marked with government badges stepped into the dining room. The sharp click of handcuffs hanging from their belts resonated through the quiet house like a death knell for the Vance family empire. Panicked, Julian dropped to his knees right beside my chair, completely casting aside the arrogance he had worn just minutes prior. "Clara, please," he begged, his voice trembling with pathetic desperation as tears welled in his eyes. "We're blood. You're my sister. You can fix this with your clearance. Just tell them it was an administrative mistake. Don't let them ruin my life." I looked down at him, feeling no anger, no satisfaction, only a deep, cold pity. "Integrity cannot be bought, Julian," I said, my voice unwavering. "And it certainly can't be bullied out of me. You made your choice when you put soldiers' lives on the line for profit." My father slammed his hands on the table, trying one last time to command the room. "Clara, I am your father. I built everything you see here, and you built it on a foundation of lies and treason," I replied calmly, turning to face him. The federal agents stepped forward without hesitation. Within moments, cold steel cuffed my father's and brother's wrists behind their backs. My sister Evelyn sat frozen in her chair, weeping silently into her hands as she watched our family's glorious legacy crumble into total disgrace right before her eyes. They weren't powerful executives anymore. They were just federal suspects facing grand larceny and defense contract fraud charges. As the officers escorted them out into the cold night, Julian turned back to look at me, but I simply turned my back on him. The mansion was completely silent once the flashing red and blue lights faded from the driveway. All that remained was the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and my sister Evelyn, still sitting frozen at the dining table, staring at the empty chairs. I walked upstairs to my old bedroom, pulled out a small leather duffel bag, and packed only what truly belonged to me: my mother's vintage jewelry box, a few family photographs from happier times before greed consumed them, and my military uniform. I left behind the designer handbags, the expensive clothes, and every luxurious souvenir funded by my father's tainted money. As I walked down the grand marble staircase for the very last time, I paused at the front doors to take one final look. The Vance family empire was finished. Within 48 hours, federal authorities seized all their corporate assets, frozen bank accounts, and properties. My father and Julian were eventually convicted of high-level defense procurement fraud, receiving lengthy federal prison sentences without the possibility of parole. Standing on the porch under the night sky, breathing in the fresh air, I felt lighter than I ever had in my entire life. My family had spent years measuring my worth by money, titles, and superficial status. But as I stepped into the back of the military vehicle waiting to take me to headquarters, I knew the truth. Real power isn't about looking down on others. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. Looking back, I realized that being called useless by people who only value money was actually the highest compliment I could have ever received. They were trapped in their own greed, while I was out there quietly saving lives and building a career built on real honor, integrity, and purpose. Never let anyone who doesn't know your true value define who you are or what you're capable of achieving. If you were in my shoes, would you have protected your family despite their actions? Or would you have turned them in for what they did? Comment the city or country you're watching from today so I can see how far my story has reached. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more stories like this. Thank you so much for watching until the very end, and I'll see you in the next video.